or something.
Well, I'm just talking about seasonal stuff. So like think about what happens seasonally in agriculture versus if there was like a year, like a shock was over the whole year.
Okay, so like seasonally, it might be better to hire like more laborers.
Yeah.
And just invest in like more unskilled labor.
Yeah.
Over the long run, I think like it might be better to sort of avoid a lot of the farming techniques that are wasteful. The seasonal adjustments.
Yeah, that's right. So I think you can actually think of lots of the migration patterns in the world as being examples of this, right? Because there's lots of places that are much more populated during the harvest season than they are in other times. That's just a variable factor coming in and then leaving, and the ratio of people to land, that is the population density, changes over time, right? The ratio of the fixed to the variable factor changes because there's these short-term shifts. So in fact, you can think of a lot of things about migration and population density as just being examples of this general effect. Yeah, Eric?
So I looked at the mortality rate in the Iraq War, and it's actually very low. It's 3.9 deaths per 1,000. Like,
no, I agree. I'm thinking of something more on the order of like World War II, or like, yeah. But actually, I think there is a version of that here, because people get exhausted. They like went to war in Iraq, and now they don't want to re-enlist. You see what I mean?
It's like
so,
PTSD. Like they may still not be.
Yeah.
I was just thinking that like maybe it's sort of durable in a low mortality war, because it's like, oh, this soldier's going to be a soldier for like 5 years.
But I actually think people get exhausted over that range. But yeah, probably within a 4-year range. See, this is what it really matters what range you're talking about. So.
I mean, because I was thinking it's mixed, isn't it? It has a depreciation rate, but then you're also using the
Yes, it all depends what time horizon you're talking about. So, adjustments to secular trends in medicine are another example of this. Zhao Long is not here, right? So, what do you think people think are the short and the long run adjustments to secular trends in medicine? Yeah.
If like it's a short-term increase, we can ask doctors to work more, or if it's a bit longer, we can train more doctors with same hospitals. But if like it's very long-term, then we can like increase the number of schools. Yeah,
that's right. Exactly right. How about cyclical adjustment? I know cyclical adjustments to demand for gold versus the end of the gold standard. What happens when there's cyclical increases in the price of gold versus the end of the gold standard, which caused a permanent decrease in the demand for gold? Does anyone want to talk about that?
I remember for a while, like 100 years ago, people were shipping gold across the Atlantic, like when there were changes in currency demand.
Yeah.
Sort of cyclical, like if you would look at it over like yearly rates. These were like during the bank run.
Yeah.
But I guess the end of the gold standard would completely change the supply of gold.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the way I think about it is that, like, after the gold standard ended, mines all over the world shut down. I mean, it used to be that there was like tons of, mining was a much bigger part of the economy before the gold standard ended, and then there was a big reduction in mining. On the other hand, when there's cyclical increases in the demand for gold, usually what happens is people just melt down their jewelry and sell it back to the market. So local, another example of this is how local governments versus corporations responded to the financial crisis. Does anyone want to talk about, Stieg, do you want to talk about that?
So you want to, like, the local government response would be to maybe have some stimulus or increased money diverted to food stamps and programs like that. I don't know how much local government has in the way of stimulus, but a corporate response would just be to fire people and just become a leaner organization.
Well, see, I actually think that the local governments laid off a lot more people than corporations did. In fact, that's what the data shows. And the reason is that the local governments felt that this was a permanent shock because the Tea Party was getting so powerful and they would never get refunded. Whereas the corporations thought that this was a temporary cyclical thing, so a lot of them kept their workers, didn't fire them because they didn't want to have to hire new workers and retrain them, right? So depending on whether, one thought it was a short Another thought it was a long-term shock, and that affected things. Okay, so I didn't get through all of this. I'll pick it up again on Tuesday. I think people need to go, unless most people think they can stay. How many people can stay for 10 more minutes? Oh, I guess most people can stay. Okay, I'll finish this up then. Okay, so it'll be on the video for other people. Okay, so it's not only the expected duration, but also the time since the shock that matters. Because in fact, one thing that's durable is the process of hiring people and adjusting to a shock, right? So there can be lags in returning back to a pre-shock equilibrium. One good example of that is that drug demand through Mexico radically increased. So there were all these people who got trained to be like criminals, basically, right? But now, even though that has receded to some extent and there's been a crackdown, competition, even though there's been a crackdown, now all the gangs have all these people who are trained, and now they're like diversifying into other things like kidnapping and other sorts of crime, because they all got all this training in being criminals, right? And so now that the shock happened, there's this gradual process of getting people out of that sector, and they're diversifying into all these other things. That also happened with paramilitaries after the Colombian Civil War. It happens after many civil wars, that the Civil War endures for a while, but then there's a lag in returning back to the equilibrium, and there's lots of violence during that period because people are now don't have anything to do. There can also be lags in getting to the post-shock equilibrium. So the greatest relative demand for Google was probably actually about 6 years ago. But the problem is that it took them forever to hire all the people to do all that stuff, right? And so they're just now getting up to the scale that they wanted to be at effectively 6 years ago. Because you actually not only needed to hire people, but you need to hire HR people who could hire people, right? And there's also lags in adjusting to or away from cyclicality. So an example of that was that with the emergence of foreign imports and changes in agricultural technology, there have been changes in the migration patterns to California, and that's been very complicated because you have to change the whole immigration law, you have to change the way you deal. So changing to and away from cyclicality can be a gradual process. So one really interesting sort of example of these types of dynamics is this paper by Rosen et al. 1994, who looked at, this is the time series of cattle stocks in the United States. And you notice it has this very regular cycles. Why is that? Well, what happens is that imagine that there's an increase in the demand for cattle. Well, if it lasts for a very short period of time, you might just slaughter more cattle. But if it lasts for a little bit longer, you actually want to reduce the number of cattle that's supplied right now, because that lets more of them breed and supply more demand later. And so what happens is that you get one of these shocks, and it just ripples through the years. You reduce now, you have more later, then you're supplying more, and then that kills them more off, and then you have a decrease in demand, and you get these cycles rippling through from just a tiny little shock at one period, right? Okay. Uncertainty may also play an important role in lags. So imagine that it's Christmas, and there's this huge demand for Xboxes, right? Microsoft would probably say to itself, oh, it's just Christmas. We're just going to go and contract with someone to build some extra Xboxes for us rather than build an extra factory. But what if it turns out that actually it just happened that this was a long-term shock in the demand for Xbox that just happened to happen during Christmas? Now, if it had happened during another time of the year, Microsoft might have said to itself, let's build more factories to be ready for this. But if it happens during Christmas, they get tricked by the fact that they're used to having a cyclical shock then, and they miss the fact that there was actually a long-term shock. So other industries that don't have as much cyclical demand might have caught that Christmas shock more easily than Microsoft would have been, and would have done the long-term adjustment more quickly, right? And that, there's an interesting paper by Helwig, 2011, that thinks about that in terms of adjusting prices of firms. So imagine, why might firms have a hard time adjusting their prices, might have sticky prices, even if there's only a small menu cost? Well, they might be used to seeing lots of little cyclical, short-lived shifts in the demand for their product, and not really think about adjusting their prices in light of those, just adjust their production. But then, if they find out that it's actually a macroeconomic effect, they would want to adjust their prices. But that might require them to read the newspapers and really think about how that affects their industry and so forth, and not just do the things that they're used to, which is just observing the demand in their area, right? So just thinking about these static things, you see how all the richness of dynamics you're able to get just out of thinking about this notion of durability and storability. I think it's pretty amazing. Okay, so far I've focused only on durable inputs. But now I want to consider the most extreme counterexample, which is the case of oil, which can basically be costlessly stored in the ground and is very cheap to take out. Now, oil needs to always have its price rising at exactly the interest rate. Why is that, Steak?
Well, I guess, you mean like...
if oil could be perfectly stored in the ground and cost nothing to extract, why would its price always have to rise at the interest rate?
I'm not sure.
Anyone else want to? Neil?
Would there be an arbitrage then? Like you could choose to store it and let it appreciate, and like however it works, right? And then give out the money or vice versa.
Yeah. So the point is, if it was, if it grew slower, then you could sell all your oil today and save the money and have more. If it grew faster, then you could borrow any money you need now and then sell all your oil tomorrow and pay back the loan, right? So what that means is that if there's a short-run shock to the price of oil, however it adjusts prices, it's going to have to adjust all prices in the future, all at the same time for that short-run shock. And that means that you could only possibly increase the price of oil by a tiny amount if it was truly a short-term shock, because it's going to have to adjust all the prices for the future, right? And this is why gas prices hardly increase during the summer, because they just pump out more oil from Saudi Arabia, basically, right? On the other hand, when we get news about climate policies, those can dramatically increase oil prices, even though they don't really change the demand at all right now, right? So oil responds very much to these long-term news things and very little to these short-run demand shock things. So, and it also says that a carbon tax that's uniform across time has no effect on anything. It's only the path of carbon taxes that matters, because we're going to use up all the oil that's in the ground at some point, because it's basically costless. Unless you get literally to the point where everything, other resources are free, or the carbon tax is so high that just the carbon tax is the same expense as green technology, we're all going to end up using our oil at some point. Really, it's the path of the taxes that matters, not their level. Okay. Now, this oil and other exhaustibles are an extreme case, but an important one. But the broader lesson I'm trying to teach you is that you hear all these just so stories about this curve is more elastic in the long run, or this curve is more inelastic in the long run. And we take these totally for granted when someone says them to us without really thinking about what the underlying reasoning behind it is. So for example, in micro, you're always saying that the long run is more elastic than the short run. But in macro, we say the aggregate supply curve in the long run is completely vertical. Is that really true? Well, think about it. This is really using exactly the exhaustible resources model. That's the reasoning behind that claim that the long-term supply curve is fixed. It's that, well, we might be able to move things in the short run. There's only a certain amount of resources in the economy, and if we use them more now, we can't use them later, right? But do we really believe that analysis? So, for example, imagine that what you're doing now by getting the economy back up to its potential is actually creating innovations and capital and investment that will increase the potential of the economy in the future. Well, then it's not at all clear that the economy is more elastic in the short run than the aggregate supply is more elastic in the short run than in the long run, right? So my hope is that you'll come away from this and be more critical about evaluating economic ideas. You never get something like the elasticity in the long run versus the short run for nothing. It always comes from an assumption about intertemporal complementarity or substitutability or something like that. And so whenever you see a magical result, you should always look for the assumptions that are hidden behind it. And when they're not transparent, they're often actually incorrect or at least limited. So I hope that you'll learn to think about economics not as a set of results, but as a toolbox for structuring your language about talking about the world, as I talked about a few days ago. So thanks.